So I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Shay Furster. I am trained as an accountant, but I hope to give a message to you that you may not be expected from an accounting firm or an accountant. In addition to doing the typical accounting things, financial statements and tax returns, I also head the Ag Digital group for MNP. And in addition to that, I'm also what my friends refer to as a Hollywood farmer. So I farm with my brother, but because I don't drive tractor very much, I don't get to qualify myself as a farmer. But I love the business of farming. The clients I deal with are all farmers, and I'm very active in our farm business. I just don't drive tractor very much.
So I'm Colin Wingates. Unlike Shay, I'm not an accountant. My background is data analytics, data science, and I basically lead our national analytics practice for the firm. So working really closely with Shay with regards to how we can utilize data from an agricultural perspective to enhance performance, optimize performance, etc. So I am one of the what we call facilitators that is not an accountant.
All right, so I mentioned that I head up Ag Digital. You're saying, well, what is Ag Digital? And so I also was wondering what that was. We have digital consultants, and I was trying to figure what they did and how we could apply it to our industry. And they said, well, you know what? Most technology is created because it's cool, and then it goes looking for a problem. He's like, how technology really helps people is if you have a good question and see if technology can help you find the answer. And so threw on my accounting hat, and I said, you know what? I know the question I want to ask. We can have, you see, every year, we'd always see this. You'd see farms that, while are nearby, would have similar weather, similar land, they'd have completely different outcomes from a profitability standpoint. And we put our heads together, all the accountants were like, I wonder why that is. We're accountants, we should be able to figure this out. And we came up with the answer. Management. Which didn't help anything. But we did know that there was a trend around that. So we went to the consultants and said, okay, here's the question. What makes the difference between a good farmer and a great farmer? And they're like, well, what do you mean? So go to that. So being accountants, we turned this into a math question. So normally in a smaller room, I ask this question to saying, okay, so two farms, side by each, similar land, similar weather, similar crops, probably similar equipment. How much deviation on a 10-year average could you expect on profitability between a good farm and a great farm? So we took a batch of clients, almost 200, over a 10-year average, and said, what's the difference between the median and the top 25%? Any guesses? Like I said, normally in a smaller room, people will throw out an answer. 50% more profit? Good. Yep. I also accept profit per acre. $100. Well, somebody may have seen the presentation before. It's $100. Which boggled my mind. But then when you go into the numbers, it's more than just $100 because the reason it boggled my mind is on a 5,000 acre farm, which is very typical in Saskatchewan, $100 more profit is generational wealth over 10 years. And I didn't know that there would be that much deviation. But if you look at the numbers, I'm like, you know what? Those great farmers are probably spending more on fertilizer. So MNP, we put all of our statements in the same order. So the first line after revenue is production expenses. These are the expenses you can differentiate between a canola acre and a wheat acre. Seed, fertilizer, chemical, crop insurance premiums. I'm like, you know what? Those great farmers are probably spending more on inputs. It's identical. Labor, power, machinery, those are the other variable expenses that relate. They will go up as you increase acres. So those are primary labor, fuel, repairs, equipment depreciation, equipment lease payments. As you can see, the good farmers spend a little bit more, but it's only $5. Land building finance, the two big ones of that are land rent and interest. And those are also close. The good farms probably pay a little more interest because they have debt, because the great farms make way more money. Makes sense. Where most of it, over $90, existed in revenue. I said, oh, that's interesting. So I said to this group, I said, okay, help me understand why great farms generate $90 more revenue. There's three options. They could be marketing better. Maybe they deal with Cargill and they get way better advice and can achieve a better number. Maybe they grow more crop. And the third one, which I know is part of it, is a quality factor. Great farms get the job done on time, as fast as they can. So in a tough harvest, the great farms get more off before the grain degrades. All the costs are exactly the same, yet they achieve a higher price for their crop. Just in better marketing, it's actually just execution. So we sent out these guys, a bunch of non-ag experts. The closest thing we had to a person with an ag background in this group had worked one summer on his uncle's farm, picking rocks. We sent them out. They had a process to follow. They mapped out what happens on a grain farm, talked to a number of clients. We interviewed about 30 clients over this. They identified 100 different data points, decision points throughout the year of the crop cycle, and then determined that they seen a correlation on 35 of them. To say that we think these 35 data points, while they may not tell us the whole answer, they will give us a really good insight into what the differences are. So we're like, okay, let's start measuring it, see what happens. So while I'm trained as an accountant, I still like to go back to that. So they also gave us an insight on what they were, same group, they said, okay, here's what we've seen the deviations on. So the great farms, they test and repeat behavior to see if they see any difference, always trying new things, looking to see if they can move just a little bit better. Where everybody else will adapt it once it becomes the norm. But great farms are always have at least one or two ideas that they're working on. Optimizing inputs. So as I showed in the last slide, it wasn't that they were spending more, they might be spending differently. They probably are spending differently. And it was less about that, it was more around the fact that I had no idea how few farms actually did soil testing. And that was mind-boggling to me because I'm like, well, how do you know how much to put on there if you don't know how much is in there? And I've since discovered that part of the reason is because they always seem to come out the same and there's not that much deviation. So, but it was still like less than 25% of the market we found was doing a good job of getting soil samples in the fall. So they had an understanding of what was in the soil. The third one was agronomist collaboration. Great farms either have a really strong relationship with an agronomist or are an agronomist themselves. Makes a lot of sense. Again, I was also shocked that the size of the market that would only take free agronomy advice, which typically was a person who was also trying to sell them something, or took no advice at all. The next one, which is one thing that I knew we were going to be going down the path, the reason I had actually said they're like, well, can you give us any thoughts to what you think this is? I'm like, I have a question I want to get answered. If I asked every one of my clients, if you could seed your whole farm in 1 week, would you have a preference? 100% of my clients would say yes. And I'd say, why? And they say, because I always get the best crops then. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Do you know how often that is? Not really. Do you know how much that is? Not really. But I know my heart of hearts says I do. And that would be awesome. If it was purely a seed timing thing, I would be an accountant telling my clients to go buy more drills. Because if I could get 8 bushels an acre more just by seeding in that 1 week, where all my costs are pretty much the same, I would do it because that makes money. And to this record, I've never actually told a client to go buy something because they already bought everything. But any accountant in the room knows what I'm talking about. I found out after the fact, yeah. Anyway, so they've identified execution times, seeding dates, spraying dates, settings, and things like that. Hitting that, there is a difference. The best example is fungicide. You can apply it within a week of each other. The cost is identical, but the outcome for the plant health could be drastically different. So you wouldn't see it in the cost, but you'd see it in the outcome. And the last one is tracks operational data. And probably the better part of this is good data. The reason I say this is because, and it doesn't matter whether they're using a system or a book or whatever, they do know it's good data, and they are making a focused effort on tracking it, is the one difference. The joke I have is, farmer my brother, and he would be very much hit the top 25 as far as he is a great farmer. I went and looked at the sprayer, say, okay, we got all this good data, I want to see this data. You know what my brother sprays on every field, every time, 5 times a year, according to our sprayer? Roundup. That's not the case. Not very good data. So I said, what did we actually do? And he has to bring out the book and tell me what we actually did. So I was boggled to know that those were the things that, the differences. And like I said, there was no this was purely from these people going down, following a process, interviewing all these farmers, and these are the trends they identified. Oh, went the wrong way. So our goal, I'm a big believer, picture's worth 1,000 words. Our goal is to turn a conversation into this. So we have 2 fields, same crop, completely different outcomes, 18 bushels difference. And in fairness, on the right side, there was a weather event. And if you'd asked the farmer what the difference in these 2 fields are, I got some hail, and he would be right. Where we want to change the conversation is, you know what, we believe 6.5 bushels of the difference related to the hail. You were right, that was out of your control, let's not talk about it. But there's 12 bushels that we think are within your control. It was the fertilizer that you put down, it was the soil composition. We noticed great farms typically that had better soil health, better condition of the crop, they instantaneously on day 1 had an advantage. They were going to get, in this case, 3 bushels an acre more, just because of better soil health, seed placement, and then the plant water is our execution times that we believe the timing of fungicide and the time of desiccation impacted the yield. This is mostly an example, but wouldn't that be a great conversation to say, of the 18 bushel difference, we believe 12 bushels were within your control. Rather than, it was the hail, what can you do?
Thanks, Shay. So Shay engaged our team back in, I think it was 2019, if I'm not mistaken. We've been on a 3-year journey over the last couple of years, just kind of going through how can we utilize data to answer some of the questions that Shay alluded to. When we look at that yield difference, what are the key components that we can change, that we can manage, that allow us to close that gap to the greatest extent that we possibly can? And it was really around using analytics as a tool, as a bit of a facilitation tool. I always say from an analytical perspective, my background is not agriculture. I've been involved in it for 4 or 5 years now, but that's really not my background. And it's immensely powerful as you get into this with our whole team to realize how much opportunity there is in this space. It's interesting, we have a whole bunch of people, to Shay's point, that didn't come from an agriculture background, have mathematics backgrounds, data science backgrounds, machine learning backgrounds. And kind of the consensus opinion amongst everybody is there is an incredible amount of opportunity here if you get the data right and you're able to put it together properly. And so we really started down that path, and what we developed was a machine learning model. And just to give a bit of context with respect to machine learning, we do a lot of benchmarking. So you're comparing, your own fields to your own fields, or, fields within the same province. But we really wanted to get to a place where if we had sufficient data, 500 plus fields with the same crop variety, the machine learning model could learn how do you optimize all the inputs if you're normalizing for soil types, if you're normalizing for weather, if you're normalizing for certain variables. And really what we did is develop a first tool set with respect to this. And that's, we've outlined a short excerpt here. What this really does, and this is just a small excerpt out of one of the reports, is it looks at a couple of key variables and says if you were to input these changes, so in this case it was lower fertilization, what's the impact from a profitability perspective? And it's important to say profitability, right? We're looking at yield, but we're also looking at input costs. It's one thing to say add more fertilizer, it's another thing to say here's the input costs associated with that fertilizer, and does the yield cover that off? In this case, we looked at this specific field and we said the opportunity to optimize is about $27 an acre. And what really happened here is this field was just over fertilized. There wasn't really a lot to optimize from a seed perspective, but there was a lot to optimize from a fertilization or fertilizer perspective. And so what we do as part of this process is we go through two steps. The first step is really what we call a post-season analysis. So when we engage somebody as part of the process, we take a look at all their field data and we grab it field by field, and we walk through a model to say, looking at last year, on a field by field basis, if we cluster specific soil types, if we cluster for specific weather patterns, if we cluster for specific crop varieties, if you were to make these changes, it would have had this impact on your profitability. So in this case, $27, the field next to it could have been $12 or $14, but really we're looking at that delta that Shay identified being the gap between a good farm and a great farm. How do you narrow that gap? And once we do that, we basically create a field by field report. So if if your farm has 30 fields, you're looking at each individual field and looking at how to optimize that field specifically. And it's not just measured against yourself, it's measured against everybody who's in that same, whether soil bucket or however we want to cluster it in that context. Once we have that, we use that as the baseline for the subsequent year. And this is where the facilitation comes in. I've always said analytics by itself, you can get a bunch of people like me in a room and we're not going to provide a whole heck of a lot of value. You need engagement from the likes of Shay, you need engagement from an agronomist who's going to be an expert, that you're working with on a pretty regular basis. And we want to facilitate that conversation, but do it quantitatively using data. And so what we do as part of the next plan is we go through the postseason plan and then we create a preseason plan for the next year. And that's in conjunction with the agronomist. So sit down with the agronomist and saying, this is what the data tells us. This is what we think the opportunities for optimization are. Let's all sit together and let's put together a plan. Shay mentioned right off the top that one of the big things about good farms and great farms is great farms are very intentional. They have a plan, they execute to the plan. And what we're trying to do is facilitate the creation of that plan. So one example we went through last year was at the end of the year, we went through a postseason analysis, we created a preseason plan, and we decided we were going to test something. So in one field, we cut the field in half, and we said there's two strategies you can take. One is a conservative approach, less fertilizer, lower seed rate. But we still think profit-wise, you're going to be out ahead. And here's the quantum we think you're going to be out ahead. Other half of the field, increase fertilizer, increase seed rate. And those were really two relatively minor changes. In both circumstances, we enhanced the profitability. One by about $11 an acre and one by about $6 an acre. But one was a conservative approach and one was an aggressive approach. So really, how do we go about facilitating that conversation?
Well, and what did you predict it was going to be?
Yeah, we were within $1 on both of them on our prediction. So I think when we said we would increase profitability by, I think it was $10.50. I think we hit it $11.10. The other one was, I think we predicted $5.50 and we hit $5.90. So the nice thing is, as the machine learning model grows and we're bringing more fields into the model, it becomes more and more accurate. And that's really one of the key components to this is, we always say it's benchmarking on steroids. You can benchmark all you want. The question becomes is, if I know I'm in this, let's say the 50th percentile, how do I get to the 80th percentile? This is intended to answer that question. This is just a quick field summary, so this is a bit deeper. The bottom left is what you saw in the previous slide, and this just gets into an example field. In this specific example, if you look at the field details section, you can see, okay, well, yield on a bushels per acre perspective, only two bushels different. It was actually almost three predicated on rounding, which is about $60. But if you look at the profit per acre, this was actually negative. So they lost money on this field in comparison to saying that the benchmark yield was $137. Why? So again, this just allows us to say, let's dig into the details for this specific field, find out what happened here, and how do we address it. When we look at it, this is pretty simple example because this field was reseeded. So again, not a whole lot of yield difference, extra chem, it was reseeded, you had additional labor, power, machinery costs, etc. So that really helps us answer the question as to why. But this isn't always the case where it's been reseeded. We've seen issues where settings are wrong, other issues. The other piece is, so we sliced it previously by field. We look at it from the other segmentation in kind of the latter end of the report. And this is looking at it on a crop by crop basis. So in this case, if you look at it, what we're trying to do through very simplistic coloration is green is good. That means you're in the top quartile. So for barley, for crop varieties, you're seeing yield is really solid. That means that you're in the top 25%. You're doing things really well, probably still area for improvement, but not an area that needs a ton of focus. You look at some of the canola, that's where you're seeing that you're not in the top 25%. In fact, for one of the fields, you're in the bottom 25%. So how do you address that? And it really allows us to say, okay, well, our suggested changes is some changes to seed rate and some changes to nutrients. And here are the changes that we expect. But the big thing is we look at not just what changes you make, what are the cost and the yield implications of making those changes. So I think when we look at a lot of this, jumping back, this is intended to provide a really detailed field by field perspective on operations, really using data to the greatest extent that we possibly can to optimize all the variables. And as we grow this and develop it, it's year 3 right now. We've identified, I think, Shay, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's about 30 variables, it's 29, 31, something along those lines. But we have a whole team of data scientists who are going through this every year as we add additional fields and looking and saying, okay, well, how do we take this to the next level? What additional variables do we need to add? And the nice thing with machine learning is you're really using a tool set that has the ability to learn on the fly. And the more you add, and the more fields you add, the more accurate it becomes. So this will continue to evolve over time.
Yeah, that's the piece of, we've been doing this for a number of years. We've got some clients quite engaged, and they're getting the idea of this is not about trying to replace the agronomist or anything. It's actually just trying to make a more robust conversation with the producer and their team to how to drive more money. Because it is easy to just say throw more fertilizer on there, you'll grow more crop. But we ultimately need to make more money, not just grow more crop. And to challenge it, to throw some different ideas, to be shot down or not, but to keep the conversation going is the critical piece. Also note that as part of the interview process, we did have a lot of agronomist collaboration on it so that we were talking the right thing, like as far as the soil clustering. We didn't just do it on soil class. We did it based on the soil measurements within from the soil testing. So our data team they now talk like they're farmers. They are speaking the language. We are engaging with the producers. All the producers say it's like, it is mind-boggling how much they know about my business. This is awesome. And every farmer, every business owner wants to talk about their business. They just love making sure the information is good, and whatever thoughts we have, they just eat it up. It's still early days. We haven't identified any silver bullets.
I think to your point, though, it is interesting. Like I went from having a team with very little ag background to a team that now you walk into a boardroom and they're talking about like soil acidity and exchange capacity and all these different variables and how do we optimize that. And it's really exciting to see because I think what it just helps reinforce is the opportunity. And when you pull together kind of the right skill sets, including the agronomist, including the farmer, to say put everybody's head in a room and determine what the best plan going forward is, there's really a big significant impact that we're seeing.
So the next question is, how do I get started? This is interesting. How do I get started? And so the answer is basically just start collecting good data. It's available. You either know what information you want to collect. You could talk to us. You could talk to your agronomist to say, maybe we say 30 data points. Maybe you want to start with 10. It doesn't matter. It's available. It's there. Find a system that works for you. There's a lot of great software products out there, but you don't need to. The one we've found to be the most accurate is the nice pad of paper in the front pocket, because there's a lot of sprayers that spray a lot of Roundup. We need to get better at that. That's going to work. The other one that is awesome, my personal passion from an accounting standpoint, is inventory. I love grain carts that have nice weigh scales on them that are calibrated. I'm like, this is awesome. We're going to nail crop inventory. And then pretty much all my clients put the lowest functioning person on the grain cart. And then what happens to that data? It's crap. It's about driving the urgency of knowing what data you're trying to collect and trying your best to collect it. By putting one of your highest functioning people on the grain cart, you would be shocked to what you can accomplish. Because you can skip that book and you can actually be pushing it straight into the cloud. But they need to know what they're doing, and they're already going to be very busy. Grain cart trying to keep up to 2 or 3 combines is already feeling like his hair's on fire, or she. So, but there is a way to it. The next one is basically, this is what thing I always say is, what questions are you trying to answer on your farm? Obviously, you're trying to make more money, but every farm, once they engage, they do have things they want to think about that makes their farm unique, their situation unique. Let's answer those as well. There are things, but you need to start off with that question, not just blindly going into this. Because we have all these guys say, have all this data and I don't know what to do with it. So the first thing we find out when we look at it is, it's not very good. Nobody's looked at it other than them. There wasn't really a purpose. They had no idea. But they're engaged, we can move, and you know what? Very quickly does that turn around. Because now we have a purpose. With the ultimate goal of, once you have a system that you can collect good data as efficiently as possible, because the other thing that was identified is we've determined the thing in highest demand, for a farmer during the growing season is time. They don't have enough time. So this can't be tedious. We can't be asking people to shut down combines because the data is not flowing. We can't be asking the grain cart to stop and have the combine stop because they're doing something for the data. This needs to be easy. It needs to work. It needs to get quality data. Because once we're there, we know the path will get there, that we are going to be able to create insights, make plans easier, adjust plans as things change, and we're going to move this forward. I mean, the best analogy is this is Moneyball for farming. And look what happened in baseball. You don't have a baseball team without an analytics department anymore. Do they make all the decisions? No. Is it perfect? No. This isn't about us predicting the future, but changing the conversation from, I think that works most of the time, to 82% of the time that works. And it's going to get you 3 bushels an acre, 82% of the time. That's still not locking it in, but it's a lot easier to make a decision.
I think one thing just to add to that, Shay, which you made a really good point, is you hear a lot about using data, using analytics in agriculture, and I think there's always this tone of it can be a bit intimidating, going like, how much data do I need to collect? What systems do I need to use? How do I integrate everything? Oftentimes it's starting really simple. It can be a bit daunting at first, but it's really just kind of sitting down and saying, to Shay's point, what are the questions you want answered, and let's start there. You don't need to collect it all, but let's collect the kind of key components that you need to answer those questions. Then build from there, right? So if I'm able to answer the first set of questions in year 1 and 2, then I can move on to say, okay, what are the additional data points I need to answer the next set of questions? I know a big thing when we started right from the get-go with this project is analytics has this tendency to sometimes turn into science fair projects. These kind of cool ideas that just continue to grow and develop, and they become really theoretical and conceptual and have very little practical value at times. The one kind of overarching thought process we've kept with respect to this is pragmatism. It has to be practical, it has to be useful, and it can't be something where you need to implement all sorts of sensors and other tool sets and integrations in the cloud to be able to utilize it. The entire intent behind this is to be very, very pragmatic. It gets more complex as you scale up in this process, but you can start very simply.
Yeah. My biggest complaint early on in this thing was it wasn't sexy enough. We were just telling guys to slow down the drill. focus on setting the combine. But you know what? That's actionable. That's something everybody understands, and we know it has an impact on profit. So the next question, which has been covered a few times during this conference, is why isn't there investment happening? Why hasn't this taken off? I went down this rabbit hole 11 years ago, met a hell of a salesman. He had me convinced. I went to my boss and said, you know what, we need to start on this yesterday. Like, we are falling behind. But at that point, had she asked me what I thought 2022 was going to look like, I was thinking we were going to have frickin' flying combines probably at that point. I thought this would all be automated, this would all be done. We haven't really moved a whole bunch because of the roadblocks. They're all real. Number one, investment risk, it's not cheap. Number two, it's not easy. Often it takes a lot of time, which I said was the most limited resource of a farmer during the growing season. So the big farms can do it because they can hire a person to manage it. But that's not most of the farms out there. The data is crap. Like I said, it's not, because there hasn't been a focus. There hasn't been a reason. Up until 4 years ago, somebody says, okay, Shay, you love data. Why? Well, I know it's the key to the future, but I couldn't answer the question. I can now say it makes more money. Now that gives a person a reason to make sure that it's good data. And the last one is customer support. There maybe has been a lot of salesmen that have sold things and then just never returned a phone call afterwards. That was the biggest frustration amongst it, so they just threw their hands up and said, you know what, this is fine. I'm just going to keep going where I'm going to go. That's getting better. Those businesses don't typically keep going, so the guys that are still talking about it are more focused on this. This is still the future, but it's probably just not going to go as fast as I was expecting, but it's still going to go there. And I know that because I don't have to convince a young person that this is the future. Our farm, I have an adult nephew that's coming home to take over the farm, and I bring up data. His dad, my brother, walks away, and my nephew's like, oh, what do we need to do next to get it done? Because he's used to running around with a satellite in his pocket and glued to his hand, so he's expecting to work like that. So this last slide is basically just explaining, well, we need to start. This is the potential that is there of all the things that we will be able to do, the insights you'll be able to do, the automation that is available. But rather than go into the details to what this is, it is more of, this needs to make sense for the farmer. This needs to help the farmer make more money, or else why are we doing this? The reason we're doing this MMP is because we need our clients to be profitable, or else I can tell you how profitable our business is going to be. So let's help the farmers make more money. Use the data for themselves. This isn't about us selling it to Bayer or the government or whatever. This is about creating a database that helps our engaged clients use the data to move their business forward. Accountants are, my bad joke about this is loose lips sink ships and accounting firms. So this isn't about us having all this information and telling somebody else. It's about engaging, creating a database. We're very good at privacy, we're very good at numbers, we're very good at interpretation, and we just want to be at the table to drive your business forward.
I think just to add a little bit to that, when you look at a slide like this, it can probably be a little bit intimidating using like farm management systems and all these other tools that are out there. I think the biggest suggestion I've always said is just get started. It builds over time. And I always reiterate the same point. What are the questions you want to ask? Let's start with those data points and build from there. It doesn't have to be overly complex to start with, but it gets us going. And I think one of the things when I started looking into agriculture years ago, working with Shay and his team, was it's incredibly complex. Like, it's an industry where there's just so much going on. There are so many systems, there are so many tools. But when you distill it down to the core on the key points that we need, it really makes it simpler, and it's a lot more pragmatic. So again, just something when you look at a slide like this, it can be saying, what is the data maturity that you want? You can start at a very, very simplistic level, and you can build from there. You can make it incredibly complex, but there's a process to this. There's a journey to this, and the entire intent at the end of it is, Shay always keeps reminding me. He's like, at the end of the day, you can come up with whatever cool toy you want, whatever chart needs to look like, whatever model you want. Does it help us make money? Right? Does it enhance our profitability? If it doesn't, I don't want to see it. And that's kind of been the motto for us as we've progressed through this.
Yeah. Would you spend your money on what we're doing? If not, then let's quit talking about it. So we've just covered a lot. I hope we achieved our goal of maybe giving you a presentation you weren't expecting from an accounting firm. But and because of the big room, normally I would stop a couple times to see if there's any questions, but we do have plenty of time for questions if there are any out there. Because we also realize we're keeping you between, the questions are keeping you from lunch, so.
That enviable spot before lunch.
Yeah. So open the floor to questions.
I have a question. How do you make it, and it's for you actually,
Yeah.
how do you make it statistically sound when you're dealing with 30 farms? How did you build up enough data so that the AI would work?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first year and a half, we didn't really share results because we weren't confident in the model itself, for example, right? It was really around saying, how do you build an abundant enough data set and enough history to be able to actually make it useful? Now we're at a place where we have, I don't know how many hundreds of fields, well over 500 fields per crop variety, right? So you're sitting at a place where it kind of continues to grow and develop from there. And, as it develops, it's the same with machine learning. Is one of those things, the more data, the better off you're going to be, right? Exactly to your point. We're at a place now where we're comfortable with the model, where we have enough data points to make it valuable. But I mean, you look at what we want this to be a year or two from now, when you're not talking 700 or 800 fields, you're talking 1700, 1800 or 5000. The model can just continue to enhance from there. We do a whole bunch of back testing every year. So for example, for this year, what we do is we do a bunch of back testing to kind of test the results for the last 3 years, and every year we retroactively test all 3 years historically, just to make sure that there's kind of solid statistics around it. I'm not a statistician. I'm a finance person, that's my true background, but we've got a couple folks on the team with stats PhDs and things like that. So we work with them really closely to go through that process.
I can say that the journey to answer that question was, it looked different than I expected, because we got the data scientists involved, and I still remember the day Colin phoned me. He's like, I just talked to one. He's like, he is so excited about the math. It works so much better than he's used to. And I'm like, I was like, what? He's like, yeah, the model is good. And I'm like, because I'm like, we don't have that much information. And he's like, no. He's like, they're really happy where it's going, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Yeah,
a big thing is not just the quantity of the information, the quality of it, right? So we do a whole bunch of quality testing as part of that, with all sorts of outlier analysis and segmentation and things like that. There's like all these scientific names around random forest models and other things that they use as part of this, and bagging algorithms. And really what we try to do is, there's always data points we know are not going to work, but we'll remove them right from the get-go, or we'll work with a farm to say, we can tell this is wrong. Why? And we either remove it entirely or work with the farm to figure out what happened.
Knowing the right questions can be a skill of its own. How do you guide your clients and what questions they should be asking? So this is a build on. So I apologize, I missed this part of the journey. Us, like a lot of other accounting firms, are getting into benchmarking. We have been in crops and dairy and moving into other areas. But so the first year is really exciting. We're like, okay, this is where I lie. The next year they see it again. They're like, but it didn't really move. So then what's the next question they say? How do I get better? And now we have a map, and we have their map because we have their benchmarks. Well, this is the areas you should be focusing on. What are the factors of this? Now let's go down the journey. We're getting our head around this. We know that this is a major issue. The rotation impacts. Pulses are good. Pulses are good. That We know that to be true, but we are finding that there's a multitude of different choices out there. I have clients that have been growing enormous canola crops for 13 years on the same land with canola snow canola, which I thought was impossible. I wouldn't recommend it, but it is. But we are seeing the trends. If you noticed in the report, we do track the rotation in there to see if there's any, if we're seeing any insights from that as well. That is one of the data points we're looking at. But like I said, it's early days. There's no major silver bullets, but we are seeing trends already in that.
Yeah, and again, to that point, that'll grow over time. Like there's other variables we know we want to account for. It was for us saying, what are the variables that we have enough data to use? I think where you start to grow this over time is getting a better understanding of like weather impacts in certain scenarios or crop rotation. Those are all things that we're building into this over time. So start simple. Start with the variables we know we can directly influence and we know have a direct impact on the results, and then build from there. That's a really good question and very near and dear to my heart. Analysis paralysis is one of those things where I see it more often than not. There's this we have this innate need sometimes to just keep digging. And one of the things we always say is, have priorities. So I've always said, if you have more than 3 questions to ask, you have too many questions. Start with those 3. Answer those first 3, and from there you can build. And, data can be one of those things where I always use the word intimidating. I live in this stuff every day, and it's still intimidating. But if you can kind of create those 3 key questions, and I love the question, I think that was 2 questions before this around, like, how do you coach through what questions to ask? Identify those 3, and work with your agronomist to identify those 3, right? Those aren't necessarily questions that we're always going to be able to help you with, but you can work with your agronomist to say, help me understand these 3 things. Then let the data help you answer those 3 things. Once you're feeling comfortable, then start with the next 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever it is. But it's really saying, if I'm trying to prioritize 10 different questions, you're not really prioritizing. But how do we become very, very pinpointed in what we want to do? And I think that really helps get over that hurdle of intimidation around the data sometimes.
And the financial statements can tell a story. I know I tend to try to going through statements, you can tell the client, you're spending too much here, like you spend too much time with your equipment dealer, or other people are like, you know what, you're trying to grow crops you can't grow because your gross margin isn't hitting there, or you just need to grow more crop. Like there's nothing holding you back. I'm not saying you're not spending enough, but your crops should be bigger. We need to understand why that is. Those are really big questions, but it is a map and a direction for each farm, because each farm is unique in that perspective. That is one. So how do you benchmark when the producer follows green markets and not rotation? That happens. I think I've quoted an example of that already. And that's the one part where it's still the early days to be able to figure out how that works. We are tracking the rotations and seeing the impacts. But the reality is that when we say the primary driver is profitability, markets are going to go into it. When I come from the northeast of Saskatchewan, where my farm is, when oats, they're offering $7 oats, our oat acres go up because that's really good price. And so we will get some insights to see if that's actually hurting them. But the early evidence is saying that people, because of the strong relationship with their agronomists, are able to manage their way through it. Yep. 2 questions. Who owns the data and using the data in aggregate? So do we need approval from individual producers? So in the engagement letter, it is the producer's data. We're not able to sell it to anybody. But they are saying that as long as we keep their privacy intact, that it's just an aggregate. They're agreeing to put their data in there to get the outside, like to see how they compare. You can't compare against a data set you're not prepared to put your information into. At least,
No, you're 100% right. I think, at the end of the day, it's your data. What we're trying to do is facilitate that in such a way that we can add value, right? It's very simple to look at your data and say, I'm benchmarking field A to field B. How statistically valid that is probably pretty questionable. What we're trying to do is create a tool that kind of envelops all of that. So when you're talking about data privacy, data security, all those things, something we take very, very seriously, obviously as a financial firm and an accounting firm, those are things that are near and dear to our heart. And we do get approval from everybody as part of the process. So there's a whole engagement process as part of this program where we'll sit down with a farm, we'll go through that, like I said, post-season analysis. That's where we start. And that's really just saying, let's do an analysis on what's already happened and how do we optimize from there, and then working alongside the producer to facilitate the preseason plan for the next year.
yeah, it's not to create a report for John Deere. It's for help producers have a database to move their business forward. Okay.
I don't know if I follow the question, I'll be honest.
It's a big question. Does the model have an average percent effect on yield compared to before using the model? It's early days. We haven't got to that component. It is that piece of the predictability. And I'll be fair, most of our work right now is helping the client getting quality data and getting them engaged around how to collect good data and to get an answer what questions they want to have answered. These are future goals that we intend to have, but because we do know if we're not creating an ROI, the producer's not seeing value, they're not going to continue to do that. And as much fun as I'm having right now, my boss, if nobody's prepared to buy this, my boss is not going to continue to allow me to do this. So we don't have that number, but we do know it needs to move things forward, or else why do it?
Yep.
The cost per acre for the analysis and the benchmarking, it's not significant in relation to a lot of other consulting services because, like I said, most of the time it's just coaching and purifying the data. The big variable is how much work we have to do to gather the data and pure and clean it. But an answer is we're probably somewhere between $1 and $2 an acre. I'm thinking about a 5,000 acre farm. Typical is an idea to what the cost is right now because it is early. And as we get more insights and can move things forward, the cost will not go down. But and it's not a per acre basis. It's more around if somebody has really good data and a lot of acres, the cost doesn't go up per acre. It just goes up by how much time do we, because we're still trying to figure out what the most effective way for us to get the information is. All right, well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. And if you have any questions, let us know.